The failed execution of Zayden Harlow, the most notorious serial murderer you've likely never heard of, was expected to dominate the national headlines for weeks. Yet Harlow was far from a run-of-the-mill killer. The unusual circumstances of his case not only set it apart but also brought great embarrassment to influential figures who preferred to keep unsightly stories buried. In the aftermath, I was left with very little to go on. Only the first-hand details I had witnessed in the gallery and a persistent, gnawing feeling that everything was somehow my fault. I paced relentlessly in my apartment, convinced that I might wear a hole through the floor as I replayed the events over and over in the hope that some logical explanation might absolve me. Security personnel escorted Harlow into the chamber with his head already shaved clean. They secured him into the electric chair, a method he had vehemently opposed in court in favor of a lethal injection. As soon as the executioner pulled the lever, Harlow began convulsing violently. I waited for the tremors to subside, but instead they grew worse. I don't think I'll ever forget the piercing screams or the overwhelming smell of burning flesh. In a sudden flurry, prison staff drew the curtains across the witness gallery and hurried us out. I departed with the haunting knowledge that Harlow was still alive, silently praying with every passing moment that I would eventually receive the call confirming his death. When my cell phone finally rang, it was Warden Archer Blake calling from his personal number. I picked up and said, "Hello. We need to discuss Harlow's final meal," he stated. A chill ran through me. How could he possibly know? I began. In person. I sped like never before. It was nothing short of a miracle that I wasn't stopped by the police. I arrived at the penitentiary in the pre-dawn hours. The facility, reminiscent of an old high school encased in barbed wire, exuded an eerie silence along its long, antiseptic corridors. Every guard I encountered appeared agitated and on edge, as though the entire prison were holding its breath in anticipation of something. Inside his modest office, filled with bookshelves and filing cabinets and featuring a small window that overlooked the sprawling plains, Warden Blake greeted me. "It's been quite a night," he remarked, gesturing toward 2 steaming mugs of coffee on his desk. "Please have a seat and drink." I complied. "I never imagined you'd stick around for the executions," Blake commented. "Usually I don't." With a huff, the warden sank into his chair and asked, "What made last night any different?" I examined his typically bright, kind, and clean-shaven face, noting that this morning his eyes were disconcertingly bloodshot. "A victim came to me," I explained, offering a kernel of truth that he might already suspect. It made the whole case feel much more personal. "Who was it?" "Raina," I answered. "She found me and literally knocked on my door." I recalled how the poor woman looked gaunt, as if she'd forgotten to eat, clad in mismatched, wrinkled clothes. Warden Blake regarded me expectantly, so I continued. "I couldn't help but feel sorry for her. I invited her in, prepared dinner, and let her talk about her daughter, among other things. I silently mused that if only she had simply gone home. I understand you meant well, but I'd advise caution around her," Blake said, taking a sip of his coffee and smacking his lips. "Did you know that when Raina's daughter went missing, Raina herself became the prime suspect?" "No, I wasn't aware," I admitted. "Many in that small town still believe Raina is responsible for strangling her daughter. It appears no one is willing to reopen those old wounds," he said, setting his coffee cup down. "Back in the early days, when it was just a disappearance, a K-9 officer visited her. He requested one of Dahlia's favorite stuffed toys, something to capture her scent. Do you know what they discovered?" I shook my head in response. "Strange items indeed, Cassidy. Runes, peculiar little dolls, and even animal bones. She told the officer she had been performing a ritual to bring her baby back," Blake continued. She couldn't provide an alibi when Dahlia went missing, so they booked her. He paused before adding, Harlow was thoroughly trained and disciplined, undoubtedly waiting as long as he could. Yet that overwhelming impulse. He simply couldn't control himself, I suspect. I wondered if I had inadvertently divulged too much by mentioning Raina. The bottom line is that Raina might not have harmed her daughter, but she's neither safe nor stable, Blake stated. I seem to be getting sidetracked. Returning to the execution. Did you remain involved out of sympathy? Yes, you could say that, I replied. Blake nodded. All right, things escalated somewhat after you left. Would you like me to brief you on the rest? I nodded in agreement. The executioner disconnected the power at the 20-minute mark, far exceeding the intended duration, he explained. Blake exhaled deeply. By then, Harlow resembled a half-consumed candle. The bastard wasn't merely alive. He was lucid, imploring for death. How could that be? I inquired, knowing perfectly well how it must have happened. The real question was whether the warden was aware of the truth. Perhaps there was a malfunction with the chair, Blake shrugged. I ultimately decided to override his apparent wishes. He received the lethal injection and ceased breathing at 3:45. Harlow was dead. I allowed myself a slight moment of relief, though I was careful not to reveal any shift in my demeanor. What drew you into this line of work, Cassidy? Blake asked. His sudden change in topic caught me off guard. Where was he heading with this inquiry? Honestly, I responded. I despise it when you use that term, he remarked. It implies you've been untruthful about everything else. I chose an awful moment to be a chef, I said. With restaurants collapsing left and right, wasn't it around a 25% failure rate nationwide that year? Something along those lines, Blake concurred. Every reputable restaurant owner desired a chef with genuine culinary expertise, while the less reputable establishments merely sought to place me on a waitstaff so they could ogle my figure in one of those minuscule uniform skirts. I retorted. You were my only alternative. Preparing final meals for death row inmates does have its advantages, Blake noted. There are no negative reviews to contend with, and not to mention, there are no repeat customers. It's the perfect learning ground, he said with a slight smile. But that was years back. You now hold a degree with ample talent and experience. Practically anyone would have been eager to hire you. It's all about the challenge, I replied. After all, you're preparing someone's final meal. An opportunity that only comes around once. I added, except in the case of someone like Harlow. Is there any other reason? The warden inquired. I responded candidly, no. Leaning closer, he asked, you never enjoyed meddling with them, did you? Who? The prisoners. Have you ever meddled with their meals? He understood, clearly reading it in my eyes. What's going on? Engineer inspected the chair, Archer said, biting his lip and shaking his head. There was nothing amiss with it. After Harlow's heart stopped, I ordered an autopsy. Perhaps he had some bizarre medical condition. I wasn't quite sure what to expect. The warden continued, his voice trembling with anger. Do you know what I discovered? What? DNA. Specifically, a victim's DNA. Dahlia's blood mixed in with the remnants of food inside Harlow's stomach and intestines. A prickly sensation took over my face as stress sweat began trickling down my forehead, stinging my eyes. Her what? I'm asking you this as a courtesy, because I consider you a friend. Did you interfere with Harlow's final meal? My mouth parted in response. And before you answer, he interrupted. Remember what's at stake here. Sure, the state intends to keep this incident low profile, but they'll still need to investigate what went wrong. They might even perform their own autopsy and scrutinize your other meals. I need to know, How long has this been going on? Was this always some form of karmic retribution on your part? As if you were deliberately spitting in a rude customer's food at an exceptionally perverse level. Archer, you don't get it. I'm sorry, Nova, but I have no choice. I've got to fire you. You can leave without any incrimination. If you don't raise a fuss, I don't think the state will either. Food tampering? Then it clicked. Archer had assumed I'd been tampering with their food. He harbored no suspicion that anything supernatural had even occurred. He didn't know about what I had truly done, the ritual that nefarious woman had convinced me to participate in. I thought back to Raina and the vial she had handed me along with a tattered recipe card. Execution is far too lenient for him, she had declared. Feed Harlow this, and he will never know peace. Where had she obtained her daughter's blood for the concoction? And why did the lethal injection work when the electric chair had failed? A blaring siren from a distant watchtower answered my second question. Prisoner escape, Archer muttered under his breath as he reached for his phone. Before he could even bring it halfway to his ear, a corrections officer burst into the room, panting. What's happening? Are you okay? Archer asked, gesturing toward the front of his uniform, which was soaked in blood. It isn't my blood. Then whose is it? Who's injured? The coroner. Archer had nearly risen to his feet when he suddenly froze, his brow creasing. Wait. Then who's unaccounted for? Harlow, the officer stated. My breath hitched in my throat. Harlow's body is missing. The autopsy report too. Someone must have broken in and hauled it away. They couldn't have gotten far. How many were injured? Approximately half a dozen, and they're badly hurt, the officer panted. I'm uncertain about Hudson and Cruz. Medics are with them, but... He trailed off. And are you uninjured? Archer asked. No, sir. Good. You're to keep Nova safe in my office until these lunatics are apprehended. Only someone profoundly disturbed would attempt to steal the body of a notorious killer. Yeah, I concurred. He thrust one of his thick, sausage-like fingers in my direction. Don't assume I'm finished with you. This isn't the end. He was completely unaware of how accurate his threat turned out to be. The corrections officers never apprehended the perpetrators, if one could even call them that, since there wasn't really anyone to capture. One member of the riot squad raved that he had fired dozens of rounds at the charred, disemboweled corpse of Zayden Harlow. According to him, the body simply kept advancing while wailing in torment the entire time. I found the warden's favored explanation just as far-fetched. An unnameable agency, the very same one that had transformed Harlow into a ruthless instrument of death, apparently coveted his body for some clandestine purpose, and so they took it. The staff then interred an empty container in the prison cemetery, acting as though that night had never occurred. Not a single person entertained notions of witchcraft or the idea of an undead man violently escaping the penitentiary. If everyone else was willing to forget, perhaps I could too. But I couldn't. I still had the warden's autopsy report, the very document that raised disturbing questions about Harlow's last meal and the woman who prepared it. I couldn't shake the memory of the way he scrutinized me, looking so entirely ordinary. He was of average height, maintained a decent physique, and his neatly combed hair crowned a round face with a modest nose. There was nothing intimidating or particularly remarkable about him. He would have been easily lost in any lineup. Archer Blake quietly released me from my prison duties. It felt like I'd gotten off easy for what I'd done. I decided to put my talents to other use and began setting up a non-profit organization dedicated to providing hot meals to victims' families. Setting everything up required countless phone calls to secure funding, which meant that my caller ID was constantly flashing with unfamiliar numbers. So when my cell rang one weekday evening, I answered without hesitation. Hello, Kathy speaking. Kathy, I've just come across the most fascinating recipe. You ought to prepare it for your charity." A wheezy, labored voice said. "It's absolutely to die for." The caller then laughed, a sound that hovered somewhere between a cackle and a fit of coughing. "Who is this?" I demanded, though deep down I already knew. "Raina told me everything I needed to know eventually. She explained how to reverse what you wretches did to me," declared Harlow. "The bullets weren't the worst part. Being fried in that chair. Being paralyzed while they cut me open to rummage through my guts," he raved. "I experienced it all. I still feel every bit of it. The pain is unrelenting." I held the phone tightly against my ear, turning around repeatedly to ensure that all my windows and doors were securely locked. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man's mutilated remains might suddenly lurch out at me. "But you can relieve that pain," Harlow rasped. "I'd be honored, Kathy, if you'd invite me over for dinner." My phone buzzed with a text message notification showing a new image. Skeletal fingers wrapped in disfigured skin were gripping the edges of a recipe card. "Dinner for two." The witch could only transfer pain and suffering from one person to another, from Dahlia to me, and now from me to you, Harlow declared. "Follow those instructions, and you'll prepare a proper final meal for me." "And what about me?" I asked. Harlow chuckled. "You'll inherit my suffering. Every pinprick of pain I've endured since consuming that accursed dinner you prepared for me. It's a heavy burden, I admit. And if I refuse, I had hoped that your conscience would prevail, or at the very least, that you'd feel responsible for what you set in motion." He sighed, his labored exhalation crackling through the receiver. "Raina said we both needed to partake willingly. I can't force you to cook or eat, but I can certainly persuade you." "How?" "Use your imagination. Observe. And then call me back once you've witnessed enough." And with that, the call abruptly ended. An officer arrived at my house to conduct a search, and when he found nothing, he assured me he'd remain in the area and even handed me his number. My concern for my physical safety was so overwhelming that I never fully grasped the true nature of the threat the madman had issued. Despite his meticulous nature, I recognized the unmistakable pattern in the string of unresolved disappearances and murders. A pattern that pointed unmistakably to Harlow, a man who craves death, defies mortality, and remains unnoticed by everyone. And now he intends to make me pay. I know exactly what must be done to stop him, and I'm convinced that I'm the only one capable of doing so. Yet, the thought of taking on that pain myself terrifies me. Every time I muster enough strength, the memories of the agonizing screams from the witness gallery and the stench of burning flesh come rushing back. Perhaps for now, justice can wait a little longer.